So, my favorite Samsung television that I've had since the 1990s has finally broken. And yes, technically I have 3 of them now, but this is the TV I got from AST. It's also the one I RGB modded a few years ago. And this one has traveled all over the country with me many times to conventions. Here it is at my booth in Chicago, and here it is at the Let's Play Expo in Dallas. So, what's the problem with it? Well, I'll just be working along like so, and all of a sudden the screen will just start flaking out just a bit, and eventually it'll just go completely black. Now, when that happens, I can tap on the monitor and it'll come back temporarily, so I'm pretty sure it's developed a bad solder joint.
This is probably due to thermal expansion and contraction due to being turned on and off every day for 27 years straight. But it could also be some of those long car trips having vibrated something loose in there. But either way, I'm going to take this thing apart, see if I can fix it.
While we're inside, I want to attempt to fix another problem with my RGB mod. And let me demonstrate the problem. So this is an ANSI BBS being viewed in composite mode, and while the ANSI art looks nice and colorful, when you look at the actual text close up, you can see it's a bit hard to read. This is typical of composite displays. Now let's switch over to the RGB mod. I didn't move the camera, and here's how it looked before, and here's how it looks in RGB. Clearly it's much sharper, nobody would argue with that, but the problem is the background isn't really black. It has a dark gray to it, and it's not really possible to show an actual black color like this. But if we switch back to composite mode, you can see we do have a true black here. So I've always felt that my RGB modded TV gave me a trade-off between sharpness and dynamic range. Well, a few weeks ago, I got an email from a guy named James who has the same television and also decided to modify his for RGB. Although you can see he went all out and also added S-Video to his, which we're also going to look into implementing. But he managed to adjust the resistor values and got a much deeper black in RGB mode, and so I wanted to explore that fix as well. So first things first, let's get the back off the TV. It's a good thing I had this little cable here, which makes it easy to take apart. And now, with the television running, I'm going to use this plastic pen to poke around at places and see if I can identify where the bad solder joint is. And it didn't take long to find it.
Okay, I think I found it. Let's see if this does it. Yep.
I was kind of surprised, but it's actually this module where the composite video plugs in. And if you have a look at the solder joints, you can see a little ring around the joint, which indicates that the solder has cracked. I could actually fix this without taking the board out, but I need to do other things, so I'll go ahead and discharge the tube, start disconnecting things, and get this board out in the open. First things first, I'll go ahead and reflow those cracked solder joints. And then I need to remove these 3 resistors. I know it's a bit hard to see from the angle of the video, so here's a representation of the mod I did in the past. There are 2 resistors coming together like this, and I'll need to remove the heat shrink and then remove the resistor I added and swap it out for a new value. And because there are 3 of these setups, one for red, green, and blue, I'll have to do this 3 times. Getting the heat shrink off is always a pain. I usually try to slice it down the side, and that seems to have worked. And then I can try to break these loose. Insert my new resistors. Then heat shrink it all back. Okay, so that part is done. Now let's talk about the S-Video mod. I've decided not to install a regular S-Video jack and instead do it the Commodore style of having 2 RCA jacks, one for luminance and the other for chrominance. The reason for this is twofold. Reason number 1 is that this television actually has little mechanical switches inside the video jacks, both on the front and the rear, which let it know that something is plugged in. Which means if I install an S-Video jack, I'd still have to plug in some sort of dummy connector into the RCA jack here so that the TV would switch to video input. Or I'd need to install another switch like I did for the RGB mod. The second reason is that all of my Commodore video cables are designed like this anyway, and I use this TV with my Commodore 64 and 128 all the time, so this makes sense. And if I want to use the TV with something else, then I always have this cable, which converts from S-Video at one end to RCA at the other. Now, I've used this before on my Commodore 1084 monitor, and it works well. But the question is, where to install the Chroma jack? Looking at the back of this TV, keep in mind this is a North American version. In Europe, this TV was made with a SCART connector here, but we never had that connector in the USA, so RCA jacks it was. Now, interestingly enough, clearly this was designed to have 2 more RCA jacks on some high-end model, and these would have been mysterious video outputs for some reason. I'd love to use one of these holes by just breaking out the little plastic, but the RCA jacks I have are too small and won't really fit in there. So I think I'm going to try drilling out this little hole here and making it a bit larger and put my Chroma jack there. So let's get started. Okay, so there's my RCA jack. It can share a common ground with the RGB ports. Fortunately, my little ribbon cable has room for exactly 1 more wire, which is all I need for the Chroma signal, so I'm just going to pop the connector open like so, lay in the new wire, and then cut off the excess. Okay, people are going to ask, so I'm going to show on the schematic how to connect the Chroma wire to the board. But I should emphasize this information is probably useless to 99% of people because every television is going to be different, but at least should give you an idea. So first of all, if we zoom into the little jungle chip, you can see that pin 45 is in fact a dedicated Chroma input, but you can't just pipe it straight in there. And just as a disclaimer, I didn't come up with this design, I'm just copying what I was told, so I don't fully understand how all of this works, so I'm just implementing somebody else's design. So if you follow the signal this way, you'll come to this little spot right here. Now, from what I'm told, you can attach your Chroma directly here and it will technically work. But if you make a few extra mods, it will work even better. So what you would do for that is add in a capacitor here, a diode here, and then this wire here would connect to your RCA jack. And so I've already done all of that. Here's where I ran into a problem. I reinstalled the PCB and tested the monitor with composite, and it appeared totally dead.
Now, the interesting thing is the on-screen menus were still working, so you could still see that on the screen, but nothing was coming from any of the 3 video sources, except for the RGB mode, which would just roll and be out of sync like this. So the interesting thing is, this is more or less the same behavior that the TV was having before when it would flake out, so I realized I've probably not actually fixed the problem that it had all along.
I started to think it might be a problem with the front panel PCB because, as I learned when I was repairing the other Samsung TV, it will override the back panel. And sure enough, I found cracked solder joints here as well. So I reflowed all of these connectors and again, reassembled the monitor, and this time it worked. So I wanted to test out the RGB, but I found the problem was still present with the background being too bright.
So one important thing I haven't really mentioned up to this point is that due to the way the RGB mod bypasses certain circuitry in the TV, the on-screen menus where you can set the brightness and contrast have absolutely no effect on the RGB input. It only affects the composite input, or in this case S-Video as well now.
But then James suggested using the brightness control in the flyback, and I feel kind of dumb for not thinking of that myself, but I was also afraid it would make the composite video too dark. But then I realized I could compensate by turning up the brightness in the menu for that, and sure enough, that worked out just fine. And so now I want to show you the ultimate comparison. Here's composite video. Notice it's barely readable on the green and blue areas. And here's S-Video. This is a remarkable improvement, and the text is already quite readable. Finally, here's RGB, and it's even that much sharper. In fact, here's all 3 together so you can really see the difference. Of course, I've been showing this on the Commander X16 so far, and that's because it supports all 3 video types, which is good for a comparison. But let's try connecting a Commodore computer. I can even use the standard off-the-shelf LCA cable that Commodore supplies, and it will plug in the rear, just like it would on a 1702 or 1084 monitor. And the picture looks absolutely as good as a 1702. Maybe not quite as good as a 1084, but pretty darn close. Unfortunately, you'll never be able to see how good this looks from a camera due to the moire pattern that always happens, but trust me, this looks almost like it's coming from an emulator or something. So, having added S-Video now means this television has enhanced picture quality when connecting to things like certain Commodore computers, certain Atari computers that support it, CDI and DVD players, and of course a number of game consoles that support S-Video. And with RGB support, I already had enhanced picture quality with the Amiga, Apple IIgs, BBC Micro, and the Tandy Coco 3, as well as a bunch of game consoles that also support RGB. Although the BBC Micro is probably not a great example because it will be running at 50 Hz and my specific television will only run at 60 Hz, but if you had a European version of this television, then it would work in RGB. And of course, I can still use this with devices that output regular composite video, just like always, which makes this now one of the most versatile display devices in my collection. My plan is to add at least the S-Video mod to at least one more of my Samsung TVs, since it's such an easy mod to make and increases its utility so much. But that's it for this episode, so as always, thanks for watching.